Eliza Winters sat beside her father, her fingers tightening around the worn leather reins. The journey west had been long, but now they were close, too close, to the land the frontier whispered about in half-worn legends. Her father, Jacob Winters, was a hard man, weathered by the failures of past ventures. He was chasing opportunity. But Eliza could see the doubt creeping into the lines of his face. This land was not empty, not abandoned. It belonged to people who had lived here long before men like him had claimed it for their own. The first arrow struck just as the sun dipped low. The attack came fast, swift shapes moving between the trees, cutting down horses before the settlers even had time to scream. A sharp, guttural war cry split the air and chaos erupted. Eliza barely had time to register the danger before her father yanked her from the wagon, pushing her toward cover. "Stay low, girl." His voice was urgent, but his grip was rough. She felt the ground, the scent of blood and trampled grass filling her nose. Shots rang out. Shadows danced between the trees. Figures on horseback circling the wagons, taking out those who resisted. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The raiders vanished, leaving behind wreckage, bodies, and the smell of burning wood. Eliza's chest heaved. The survivors were few, their supplies scattered. Jacob cursed under his breath, checking his own wounds before grabbing her arm. "We can't stay here," he said. "There's a Hopi village nearby. We'll find shelter there." She had heard of them. The Hopi, the quiet ones, the ones who did not seek war unless it was brought to them. And now, they had no choice but to beg for their aid. The walk was grueling. The mountains loomed closer with every step, and the further they traveled, the heavier the silence became. When they reached the village, it was as if they had entered another world. Men stood tall and watchful, spears resting in their hands but not raised. Women with dark, braided hair studied them from doorways, whispers flitting between them like restless birds. The village was carved into the red earth, houses made of stone and clay, blending seamlessly into the land itself. A man stepped forward from the gathered crowd. His presence was striking, not for size, but for something deeper, something unshakable. His face was carved from sun and stone, his black hair tied back, a single eagle feather woven into the strands. He carried no weapon, yet power radiated from him like heat rising from a canyon. "You are wounded," he said, his voice measured. His gaze flicked to Eliza, lingering there for just a moment longer than it should have. "My people were attacked," Jacob rasped. "We need shelter, food, just for the night." The man studied them. The silence stretched. Then he gave a single nod. "Come." His name was Nah-Tay. Eliza learned this that night, as she sat beside a small fire, her hands wrapped around a wooden cup of warm broth. She had expected hostility, but there was none, only quiet observation. The Hopi were wary, but they did not turn their backs. Her father spoke with the elders, bartering promises for provisions. But Eliza's attention was elsewhere. Nah-Tay sat across from her, watching the flames. "Who were they?" she asked at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "The men who attacked us." Nah-Tay's eyes lifted to hers. They were dark, unreadable. "Cheyenne." The name sent a shiver through her. "They do not strike without reason," he continued. "But this land is restless. Many things are changing." Eliza swallowed hard. "And what do they want?" Nah-Tay did not answer. The wind howled outside the village walls. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried out, a lonely, haunting sound. That night, sleep did not come easily. She woke before dawn, drawn outside by the pull of restless thoughts. The village was quiet, the sky turning from ink to gold. And there, standing at the edge of the cliffs, was Nah-Tay. She hesitated before approaching, but he did not turn. "The land speaks, if you listen," he said, his voice carrying in the hush of morning. "It tells of storms before they come, of hunger before it takes root." Eliza stepped closer. "And what does it say now?" Nah-Tay's jaw tightened. "The shadow follows you." She exhaled slowly, unease prickling at her skin. "The Cheyenne?" He nodded. "Their chief's son, Toho-Tah, has seen you. He will not forget your face." A shudder passed through her. "And if I leave?" Nah-Tay turned to her then, his gaze steady. It will not matter. The truth hung between them, heavy with meaning. She was caught between two worlds now, one that wanted to claim her and one that warned her to run. And in the space between, Nah-Tay stood, watching, waiting, and she did not yet know if he was a warning or a promise. Eliza felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her wherever she went. It was an unshakable presence, a shadow that clung to her steps like a specter waiting for the right moment to make itself known. Days passed in the Hopi village, but the sense of safety she had briefly found was slipping. Nah-Tay had warned her that she had been seen, marked, but she had not understood the depth of his words until first sign appeared. A gift, a single eagle feather, tied with red sinew, left outside the dwelling where she slept. She did not touch it. She only stared, her stomach twisting with something between unease and fear. She didn't need Nah-Tay to tell her what it meant. Toho-Tah had made his claim. The knowledge sickened her, but it was not unexpected. She had seen the way men looked at women as possessions, bargaining chips in the unspoken trade of power. Among her own people, marriages were forged from necessity, alliances made with vows rather than weapons. But here, in a world where tribes balanced on the edge of war and peace, she was something far more dangerous than a mere bride. She was leverage. Her father had been the first to suggest she not refuse the interest. It could be a good thing, Jacob said, his voice low as they stood near the edge of the village, where no ears could listen. Toho-Tah is the son of a powerful man. If he favors you, we could be protected. Eliza recoiled at the words. You would sell me off like cattle? Jacob exhaled sharply. I would keep you alive. She turned from him, disgust roiling in her stomach. The conversation ended, but the reality of it did not fade. It wasn't long before Toho-Tah arrived. The Cheyenne warrior rode into the village with an entourage of men, their horses draped in ceremonial paint, the dust of their journey still clinging to their skin. He was broad-shouldered, adorned with the trappings of his status, beaded armbands, a bear-claw necklace, scars that told of battles fought and won. When his gaze fell upon her, Eliza felt it like a brand against her skin. He did not ask permission. He did not wait for invitation. He approached as if he already owned what he sought. You are the white woman, he said, his voice smooth, almost amused. I have heard of you. Eliza did not bow her head. I am Eliza. Toho-Tah's lips curved slightly, but there was no warmth in his expression. Eliza, he repeated, tasting her name as though deciding whether it pleased him. Your people are weak. They do not belong here. Her hands clenched at her sides, but she did not look away. Neither do yours. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Then, suddenly, he laughed. I like you, he said simply. You will come with me. The air around them tightened. The words were not a request. Eliza's breath caught, her mind racing. Before she could summon a response, another voice cut through the moment. She is not yours. Nah-Tay stood just beyond the gathered crowd, his stance deceptively relaxed, but his eyes locked onto Toho-Tah with quiet steel. The Cheyenne warrior's amusement faded, replaced by something darker. He turned his full attention to Nah-Tay, assessing him with the air of a man, deciding whether an obstacle was worth removing. And you would stop me, Hopi? Toho-Tah asked, his voice even. Nah-Tay did not move. She is free to choose. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest. Toho-Tah's gaze flicked back to her, considering. Then let her choose, he said. Every pair of eyes in the village was upon her. The weight of expectation pressed against her ribs made it hard to breathe. If she chose Toho-Tah, the Hopi would not suffer his wrath. If she chose otherwise, the air was too thick. She needed to escape. I choose no one, she said finally, forcing the words past the tightness in her throat. I belong to myself. Toho-Tah studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly he smiled, but it was not a kind smile. We will see, he murmured. Then he turned, motioning for his men to follow. Eliza exhaled shakily, only realizing then how tightly she had been holding her breath. The days that followed were worse. Toho-Tah's claim had not been denied, only postponed. He did not attack outright, but the signs of his growing influence became clearer. Nah-Tay's hunting traps were found destroyed, the water sources muddied with dead fish. Whispers followed him, fueled by the Cheyenne's deliberate attempts to undermine his standing. And through it all, Eliza felt the slow, creeping certainty of her fate closing in. One afternoon, she wandered beyond the village, the weight of it all pressing too heavily on her shoulders. She needed space, air, something beyond the silent stares and the expectations she could not meet. She did not hear the footsteps until it was too late. A hand closed around her wrist, iron strong, pulling her sharply backward. She twisted, panic surging, but it was Nah-Tay. His grip was firm but not cruel, his eyes intense. "You must not be alone." Eliza wrenched her arm free, heart hammering. "I am always alone." Nah-Tay exhaled, frustration flickering across his face. "You do not understand what you are to him." "I know exactly what I am," she shot back. "A prize, a thing to be won." He was silent. Eliza searched his face, something raw and uncertain churning inside her. "And what am I to you?" The question lingered in the air between them, heavier than the heat of the sun. Nah-Tay's jaw tightened, his gaze flicking away for the briefest moment. "You are different." His voice was quieter now, barely above a whisper. "But I cannot save you." Something in her chest twisted. A sound broke the moment. The distant call of a horn, a signal. Nah-Tay's expression darkened. "He is coming back." Eliza's blood ran cold. The game was ending. Toho-Tah was no longer waiting for her choice. He was coming to take it. The first sign of betrayal was a silence. The Hopi village, once alive with the soft hum of conversation, had become unnervingly still. The evening air, thick with the scent of burning sage and distant rain, pressed against Eliza's skin as she stepped outside, her pulse drumming in her ears. Something was wrong. She found Nah-Tay standing near the outer wall, his stance rigid, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. The usual calm he carried was gone, replaced by something colder, something edged with quiet fury. "They have come," he murmured. Eliza followed his gaze and saw them. Silhouettes lined the distant ridge, motionless against the dying light. Cheyenne warriors, watching, waiting. At their center sat a figure atop a painted warhorse, broad-shouldered and unshaken. Toho-Tah. He had returned, but this time he did not come to speak. The village elders gathered, their hushed words laced with tension. They knew what was coming. This was not a visit. This was a demand for her. Jacob Winter stood beside the elders, his jaw clenched, his fingers twitching as if grasping for words he could not say. When his eyes met Eliza's, she recognized something she had not wanted to see before. Resignation. He had already made his choice. She took a step back, the truth slamming into her like a physical blow. "No," she whispered. Jacob's mouth pressed into a hard line. "We cannot fight them," he said. "If we refuse, they will take more than just you." Her stomach lurched. "You would give me to him?" Her father said nothing. A shadow moved beside her, Nah-Tay. His presence was steady, grounding, but she felt the tension radiating from him. His fingers curled into fists, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. "You cannot trust him," Nah-Tay said, his voice low but unyielding. Jacob turned to face him, shoulders squared. "And what would you have us do, Hopi? Fight them? Die for a girl who is not one of yours?" Nah-Tay's silence was answer enough. A horn sounded in the distance. The decision had already been made. Before she could move, rough hands seized her arms, yanking her backward. A sharp cry tore from her throat as she struggled, but it was too late. The warriors moved swiftly, their grip unrelenting as they dragged her from the village, her father's face fading into the distance. She screamed his name. He did not answer. The world blurred into movement, bodies shifting, torches flickering, the sound of hooves pounding against the earth. Her captors bound her wrists, forcing her onto a horse. The ropes bit into her skin, the scent of leather and sweat overwhelming her senses. Toho-Tah rode beside her, his expression unreadable. "You should not fight," he said, his voice almost gentle. "It will be easier if you accept what is meant to be." Eliza turned her head, her teeth clenched so tightly her jaw ached. She would not give him the satisfaction of a response. The journey stretched into the night, the stars above indifferent to her fate. The Cheyenne camp loomed ahead, tents and fires casting long shadows against the earth. Warriors lined the perimeter, their faces unreadable as she was led toward the center of the encampment. Toho-Tah dismounted first, turning to face her. "You will be treated well," he said, reaching for her arm. "You are mine now." Eliza's stomach twisted, revulsion clawing at her throat. "I belong to no one." A flicker of irritation crossed his face, but he only smiled. "You will learn." She did not see the strike coming. Pain exploded across her cheek as the back of his hand connected, sending her stumbling. The warriors around them did not react. Eliza tasted blood, her head swimming from the force of the blow. But even as the world spun, she forced herself to stand tall, to meet his gaze without fear. Toho-Tah studied her for a long moment, then let out a quiet chuckle. "You have spirit. That will change." He turned, speaking to the men beside him in a language she could not understand. Then, without another word, he disappeared into the largest tent, leaving her surrounded by strangers. She was alone. The night passed in suffocating silence. They had placed her inside a small tent, tied her hands to a wooden post, and left her there. The fire outside flickered to the thin fabric, casting eerie shadows against the walls. Every sound, every whisper movement, sent her heart pounding. She could not stay here. She would not. Her fingers worked at the bindings, her nails digging into the coarse rope. The hours dragged, but she did not stop, not even when her wrist bled. Then, just before dawn, she heard it, a rustling outside, a shadow shifting against the firelight. She held her breath, bracing for the worst. The tent flap parted, and a figure slipped inside. "Nah-Tay." Her breath hitched. He was alone, his face shrouded in darkness, but she recognized the sharp determination in his eyes. "How?" she began, but he pressed a finger to his lips, cutting her off. His knife flashed in the dim light, slicing through her bindings in one swift motion. The ropes fell away, and for the first time in hours, she felt air rush into her lungs. They had seconds, maybe less. Nah-Tay grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the exit. They slipped through the camp like shadows, weaving between tents and silent figures. Her pulse pounded in her ears, her bare feet barely making a sound against the cool earth. Then a voice, a shout. The alarm had been raised. The camp erupted into chaos, warriors grabbing weapons, torches flaring to life. "Run," Nah-Tay commanded. They darted into the trees, branches tearing at her skin, the sound of pursuit close behind. Arrows whistled past, embedding themselves into tree trunks with sickening thuds. Eliza's lungs burned, her legs screaming for rest, but she did not stop. They reached a clearing, the river ahead glistening under the first light of dawn. Nah-Tay skidded to a halt, turning to face their pursuers. Toho-Tah emerged from the trees, his men flanking him. He was breathing hard, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think you can take what is mine, Hopi," he snarled. Nah-Tay did not speak. He only stepped forward, positioning himself between Toho-Tah and Eliza. A slow smile spread across Toho-Tah's face. "Then let us finish this." The fight began in an instant. Toho-Tah lunged, his knife flashing. Nah-Tay met him head-on, their blades clashing in the pale morning light. The sound of the struggle filled the air, grunts of effort, the scrape of steel against bone. Eliza could only watch, her heart hammering as Nah-Tay fought with deadly precision, his movements fluid, measured. But Toho-Tah was strong, stronger than she had realized. A sudden shift, a brutal strike, Nah-Tay faltered. Toho-Tah drove him back, his blade cutting a shallow line across Nah-Tay's arm. Blood dripped onto ground. Eliza's breath caught. Toho-Tah saw his opening. With a triumphant cry, he lunged, aiming for the kill. Eliza did not think. She acted. The world narrowed to the gleam of Toho-Tah's blade as it arced toward Nah-Tay's throat. Eliza didn't think. She moved. Her hands found a heavy stone at her feet before her mind could register what she was doing. She swung with all the strength left in her battered body, her muscles screaming as the rock connected with the side of Toho-Tah's skull. The impact sent a sickening crack through the air. Toho-Tah staggered, his balance faltering as the knife slipped from his fingers. His dark eyes, filled with shock, found hers. For a moment, time held still. Then he collapsed. Silence settled over the clearing, broken only by the distant rush of the river. The warriors who had come with him froze, their gazes locked on their fallen leader. The weight of what had happened pressed down on the earth itself. Nah-Tay was the first to move. His fingers wrapped around Eliza's wrist, pulling her back from the body before he turned to face the others. Blood stained his arm, his breath ragged, but his stance was unyielding. "Go," he commanded. The warriors hesitated, eyes darting between the unmoving form of Toho-Tah and Nah-Tay's resolute figure. Then, without a word, they stepped back, retreating into the shadows of the trees. Eliza sucked in a trembling breath. The night, heavy with its burdens, was finally breaking. Nah-Tay swayed slightly, his exhaustion finally catching up to him. Instinctively, she reached for him, steadying him with hands that had only moments ago sealed their fate. He looked at her then, something raw and unspoken passing between them. "You should have run," he murmured. She held his gaze, her fingers tightening against his. "Not without you." They had no time to linger. The Cheyenne camp would soon learn of Toho-Tah's fall, and when they did, retribution would follow. Their only hope was distance, disappearing before vengeance found them. The journey through the wilderness was grueling. They pushed through exhaustion, their bodies bruised and battered, the weight of the night pressing down on them like a ghost that would not let go. Every snapped twig, every shift of the wind felt like an omen, a reminder that they were not yet free. Eliza barely noticed when the first hints of dawn touched the horizon. Her body ached, but she did not stop. Nah-Tay moved beside her, his steps measured despite the wound at his side. He did not complain. He never did. By the time they reached the Hopi village, the sun had begun its slow climb, golden light spilling over the red cliffs. The sight of home, of safety, should have brought relief, but Eliza saw the way Nah-Tay's shoulders stiffened. He knew, as she did, that returning did not mean escape. The elders were waiting. Nah-Tay faced them with quiet strength, though his wounds betrayed his fatigue. Eliza stood at his side, unwilling to shrink from the judgment in their eyes. "The Cheyenne will come," one of the elders spoke, his voice grave. "You have killed their leader's son." Nah-Tay inclined his head slightly. "I did not strike the blow." The elder's eyes flickered to Eliza. Understanding passed between them. It did not matter who had wielded the stone. Toho-Tah was dead, and blood demanded blood. Her father stepped forward, his face lined with something she could no longer recognize as concern. "You must go," he said. Eliza's heart clenched. "What?" "The Hopi cannot protect you now." Jacob's voice was measured, but his eyes avoided hers. "If you stay, war will follow." She stared at him, waiting for something, anything. That did not feel like another betrayal, but it did not come. Nah-Tay's expression did not change. He had known this was coming. "I will go with her," he said. The words sent a ripple through those gathered. The elders exchanged glances, unreadable expressions passing between them. Eliza turned to Nah-Tay, her pulse thrumming. "You don't have to do this." His gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. "Yes, I do." The moment stretched, something breaking inside her that she had not realized was still intact. She had fought so hard against the idea of belonging to anyone, of being a possession to be claimed. But this was different. This was choice. Her choice. The decision was made. There was no time for drawn-out goodbyes. The air was already thick with the unspoken understanding that the Cheyenne would come, and when they did, there would be nothing left for them here. By midday, they were gone. They moved west, away from the places where names carried the weight of history and blood feuds. The world stretched before them, wild and endless, promising nothing and demanding everything. For the first time, Eliza was not afraid. The silence between them was not heavy, but full of meaning. She glanced at Nah-Tay, the man who had fought for her, not as a prize to be won, but as something worth saving. He walked beside her, his movement sure despite the wounds he bore. Finally, she spoke. "What now?" Nah-Tay's lips quirked slightly, the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him in days. "We listen." She frowned, glancing at him. "To what?" He lifted his gaze to the horizon, to the land. It will tell us where to go. The wind whispered through canyons, carried with the scent of rain, and the echoes of a world that did not belong to kings or chiefs, but to those who dared to carve their own paths. For the first time in her life, Eliza was not being led. She was walking forward, side by side with the only person who had ever truly seen her. The future was uncertain, but she had made her choice, and she would never look back.